Everything is under control, babe. The new nanny's a lifesaver. I read that message standing in a supply closet at Fort Bragg, my flight suit still zipped to the collar, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone into the mop bucket. My son was not fine. My son had been rushed into emergency surgery 4 hours earlier with internal bleeding, and the man who was supposed to be watching him had just sent me a photo of himself on a beach in Cabo, a margarita sweating in his hand, some woman's tan shoulder tucked under his arm. I am Captain Mara Delgado, United States Army, and I once briefed a 2-star general on troop movement without my voice cracking. I did not think a man I shared a bed with would try to make me a widow to a living son. Before I tell you what happened in the 72 hours after that text, I want you to do something for me. If this story makes your chest tighten even a little, hit like, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now, because we're going to count down together and watch exactly how a soldier takes back everything that was stolen from her. Let me rewind the tape to 6:52 in the morning, a Tuesday, Womack Army Medical Center. I was 3 days back from a training rotation in Germany, sitting in a briefing room reviewing logistics reports with my XO, when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. A pediatric trauma nurse. My 4-year-old son, Eli, had been brought into the ER by ambulance. Severe abdominal trauma. Internal bleeding. They were prepping him for emergency surgery, and they needed a parent's signature immediately. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember my chair hitting the floor. I remember my XO's hand on my shoulder and the sound of my own boots hammering down the hallway toward the parking lot, and I remember calling my husband Derek 4 times in a row and getting his voicemail every single time. Cheerful, easy, recorded 2 years ago when things were still good between us. You've reached Derek. Leave a message. I drove 41 minutes that should have taken 20. I ran 3 red lights. I don't remember doing it. I remember the surgeon meeting me at the double doors with a paper mask still hanging off one ear, telling me they'd stabilized him, that he'd lost a significant amount of blood, that another hour without intervention could have been fatal. I remember asking where his father was. I remember the surgeon's face when he told me nobody had been able to reach him either. Eli had been alone at home for almost 6 hours before a neighbor heard him screaming through an open window and called 911. I stood in that ICU hallway holding a clipboard I couldn't read because my eyes wouldn't focus, and that's when the text came through. Everything is under control, babe. The new nanny's a lifesaver. There was no new nanny. I would find that out soon enough. There was only my 4-year-old son, home alone with a fever from a stomach bug he'd had since Sunday, that Derek had decided wasn't worth mentioning to a doctor, playing on the back porch railing because I was gone, and there was nobody left in that house who cared whether he lived or fell. I want to back up further, because you need to understand who I married before you understand who exposed him. 14 months earlier, Derek and I sat at our kitchen table with a contractor's quote in front of us. The back porch railing at our rental house had been failing an inspection for months. The landlord kept promising repairs and never sending anyone. I told Derek I'd requested emergency leave to handle it myself before Eli's birthday party, when half the neighborhood would be climbing up and down those steps. Derek told me not to worry about it. He said he'd take care of the railing himself, that he knew a guy, that I should focus on my deployment prep instead of playing handyman. I trusted him. I had no reason not to. He sent me a photo 3 days later, a hardware store receipt. Fresh lumber stacked against the porch. "Fixed it myself," he wrote. "Good as new." He never touched that railing. What he touched was the joint compound holding the support post to the deck frame, and instead of reinforcing it, he'd hollowed it out and packed the gap with foam insulation, just enough to hold weight for a photo, not nearly enough to hold a screaming, panicked toddler who'd climbed the rail trying to see over the fence at a dog barking in the yard next door. That railing had been sitting there for over a year as a loaded gun with my son's fingerprints all over the trigger. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because in that hospital hallway, I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was my son was in surgery, and my husband was unreachable and lying to me from what I would later learn was a resort 30 minutes outside Cabo, San Lucas. I called Sergeant First Class Renata Cruz. Renata had been my intelligence NCO for 6 years, and if you've ever needed someone who can find a ghost's dental records in under an hour, it's her. She picked up on the second ring. "Renata, I need you to find out where my husband is, right now. Track his phone if you have to. Captain is everything. Just find him." 20 minutes later, she called back, her voice careful in the way she gets when she's about to say something she knows is going to hurt me. "Captain, his phone's pinging off a tower near Cabo. There's a charge on the joint account this morning. A resort. 2 people on the reservation. I stood in that hallway and felt something inside my chest go very, very quiet. Not sad. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before you stop reacting to a situation and start operating on it. I need you to do something else for me, I said. I need you to pull every financial record on that joint account for the last 6 months. I need to know where every dollar went. Ma'am, that's a lot to dig through. I have time, I told her. My son is in surgery. I am not going anywhere. I sat in a plastic chair outside the operating room for 6 hours. I did not cry. I did not scream. I sat with my hands flat on my knees, my back straight, the way I'd been trained to sit through a briefing no matter how bad the news, and I waited, and I planned. By hour 4, Renata called back with the first piece of what would become an avalanche. Derek had been quietly draining money from our joint savings account for 5 months, small enough that I hadn't noticed between deployments 200 here, 400 there, and funneling it into a separate account he'd opened without telling me. The withdrawals accelerated hard in the last 3 weeks. A plane ticket, a resort deposit, jewelry from a shop in Charlotte, the receipt for a bracelet that definitely was not sitting in my jewelry box. By hour 5, she had a name. Priya Nair, 28. Derek's coworker at the logistics company he'd taken a civilian job with after his own time in the Guard ended. Public Instagram, mostly locked, but the geotags on 2 photos from that morning put her exactly where Renata's cell tower data put Derek's phone. By hour 6, the surgeon walked out with his mask pulled down and told me Eli was stable, that they'd repaired the internal damage, that he was young and strong and he was going to recover. I put my head down on my knees for the first time all day, and I let myself breathe for exactly 30 seconds. Then I stood back up, because the mother could fall apart later. The captain still had a war to plan. I want you to understand something about people like Derek, about the pain some of you are living with right now while you watch this. Men like him don't fail as fathers and husbands all at once. They fail in inches, in small absences you talk yourself out of noticing, until one day the absence is big enough to almost cost you your child. I moved into the hospital that night. I slept, if you can call it, sleeping in a reclining chair beside Eli's bed, one hand resting on the guardrail so I'd feel it if he stirred. And while the machines beeped their steady rhythm beside him, I opened the small notebook I keep in my cargo pocket, the one I use for mission planning, and I started writing. Not a diary, not a letter I'd never send, a plan. Step 1, freeze every account he can access. Step 2, find out exactly what he did to that railing and whether it was negligence or something worse. Step 3, find out exactly who Priya Nair was and how deep this went. Step 4, make sure a man who left his son to bleed out alone in an empty house never got to call himself Eli's father in any way that mattered again. He thought he'd married a housewife with a uniform in the closet for parades. He forgot he'd married an intelligence officer. The next morning, a police detective named Wallace came by to take my statement about Eli's injuries standard when a young child is hospitalized with a home accident, especially one where the parent of record can't be reached. I told him everything I knew, and I told him I wanted the porch railing inspected by a structural engineer before anyone touched it. Something in my voice must have told him I wasn't just being thorough. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Ma'am, most people don't think to ask for that. Most people didn't grow up watching their own uncle survive a construction site collapse because somebody cut corners on a support beam," I told him. "I know what a intentionally weakened structure looks like versus a lazy one. Get me the engineer's report." That report came back 48 hours later, and it changed everything. The engineer's name was Hollis, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd clearly seen a lot of ugly things in 3 decades of construction inspection, but still looked shaken, standing in my kitchen with photographs spread across the table. "Captain Delgado," he said, "this wasn't rot. This wasn't age. Someone opened this joint on purpose." The support was hollowed out, the structural foam packed in to disguise it visually, and then the siding was reattached to hide the seam. A casual glance, it looked solid, any real weight against it, especially concentrated weight like a child leaning on the rail, and it was engineered to give. "Engineered," I repeated. "Ma'am, I've seen shoddy contractor work in my life. This wasn't shoddy. This took time and it took intent. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and knew exactly what would happen if a small child put their weight against that rail." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just looked at the photographs. My son had a fever of 102 that week from a stomach virus. And he'd climbed onto that porch railing because a neighbor's dog was barking and he wanted to see it. And the only reason he fell forward into the yard instead of straight down onto the concrete patio slab 6 feet below was that his foot caught the lower rail on the way over. 6 inches of luck stood between an internal injury and a funeral I would have had to plan alone because his father was in Cabo. I called Detective Wallace immediately. I want this classified as more than an accident, I told him. I have an engineer's report showing intentional structural tampering, and I have a father who was 3,000 miles away with another woman while it happened. That's a serious allegation, Captain. I don't make allegations, I told him. I make cases. Read the report. While the police opened a criminal investigation, I had my own war to run in parallel. I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise Okafor, who'd handled 2 other military families' divorces on our base and had a reputation for being merciless with husbands who thought a uniform meant an easy target. Denise, I need an emergency asset freeze on every joint account. I need a temporary custody order limiting Derek's access to Eli pending investigation, and I need a divorce filing on my desk by Friday. Mara, she said, her voice quieter than usual. Are you safe? Is Eli safe? Eli's safe. He's with me. Derek's the one who isn't going to be safe from what's coming. Good, she said. Then let's build it right. Renata, meanwhile, kept digging, and what she found made my blood run cold in a way the hospital hallway never had. Derek and Priya hadn't just been having an affair. They'd been planning their exit for months. Text messages Renata pulled from the cloud backup Derek had forgotten to disable on our shared family iPad showed the 2 of them discussing my life insurance policy, a standard $200,000 military benefit, and discussing, in Priya's words, how much easier everything would be if something happened to me overseas during deployment, since accidents happen to soldiers all the time and nobody asks too many questions. They hadn't planned to hurt Eli directly. That much, at least, seemed true. But when Derek realized Eli's accident could be staged to look like negligence on my part, an absent mother, always deployed, never home, a story that would help him in a future custody fight and distract from his own affair, he saw an opportunity in that failing railing instead of a danger to fix. He didn't build the trap intending Eli to fall. He built it and left it there, knowing it might. And when it did anyway, on a day he happened to be in Mexico, he didn't rush home. He calculated. If Eli was hurt because of my failure to child-proof the house, it strengthened his position. If Eli was fine, no harm done, and he'd gotten a free vacation with his girlfriend out of it, either outcome worked for him. That's not an accident. That's a man treating his own son's safety as an acceptable loss in a game only he was playing. I sat with that message thread for a long time. Eli's small hand curled around 2 of my fingers in the hospital bed beside me, and I felt something in my chest that wasn't rage anymore. Rage burns hot and fast. This was colder. This was the feeling of a soldier looking at a confirmed hostile and simply deciding mission parameters have changed. Derek came home Thursday night, 4 days after it happened, tan and relaxed and clearly expecting the story he'd rehearsed on the flight to hold up that he'd been at a work conference, that his phone died, that he was so sorry, so devastated. Thank God Eli was okay. He walked into our house at 9 at night carrying a gift shop bag, some stuffed sea turtle for Eli he'd probably grabbed at the airport out of guilt, and found Denise Okafor sitting at our kitchen table with a folder in front of her and 2 uniformed officers standing by the door. Derek Holloway, Detective Wallace said, stepping forward. We need you to come down to the station and answer some questions regarding the injury of your son and an ongoing investigation into structural tampering at this residence. I watched the color drain out of his face in real time. I watched him look at me, standing in the doorway of the kitchen with my arms crossed, still in uniform because I'd come straight from the hospital to be here for this exact moment. Mara, he started, this is insane. I didn't do anything. The railing was old. I told you I fixed it. You told me you fixed it, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. The engineer says you hollowed it out. I have the receipts for the foam insulation you bought at the same hardware store where you photographed lumber you never used. I have Renata's financial trail. I have your messages with Priya about my life insurance policy. Derek, I have everything. His mouth opened and closed. The gift shop bag slipped out of his hand and hit the floor. The stuffed sea turtle rolled out onto the tile, and I remember thinking, distantly, that it was the most honest thing he'd brought into that house in over a year, a cheap, empty gesture, purchased at the last minute to paper over something rotten. They took him in for questioning that night. He wasn't arrested immediately, these things take time to build correctly, and Denise had drilled that into me. You don't want a rushed charge that falls apart in court. You want a conviction that holds. So while the DA's office reviewed the engineer's report and the financial evidence and the text messages, I did the other half of the work. I filed for divorce. I filed for sole custody, citing abandonment and endangerment. I had Derek's name stripped from every account, every beneficiary designation, every piece of paperwork that connected him to Eli's future. And 3 weeks later, I did something I hadn't planned on doing, but that felt, when the moment came, like the only correct order of operations left. I requested emergency leave, and I flew to see him. Not to the county jail. Not yet, that came later. After the DA formally charged him with felony child endangerment and attempted insurance fraud. Once Priya, facing her own exposure, cut a deal and handed over every message thread to save herself from a fraud conspiracy charge. I flew instead to the temporary custody hearing, where Derek sat across a courtroom table from me for the first time since that kitchen scene, wearing a suit that didn't fit him quite right anymore, like the last month had physically shrunk something inside him. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He looked at me when the judge read the engineer's findings into the record, when the phrase, intentional structural compromise, consistent with premeditated tampering, was said out loud in a room with a court reporter typing every syllable into permanent record. That's when he looked at me, and I saw something in his face I recognized from every interrogation I'd ever sat in on during my career, the exact moment a man realizes the story he built for himself doesn't survive contact with the evidence. "Mara," he said, during a recess, his lawyer half a step behind him trying to stop him from talking. "Mara, please, I never wanted him hurt. You have to believe me. Things got complicated. I panicked. I made mistakes." "You didn't make a mistake," I told him. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill. What you did was leave a loaded weapon pointed at our son's chest for over a year because it was inconvenient to fix it and convenient to let it exist as a fallback plan. You didn't panic in Cabo. You calculated. And I have 4 months of your own handwriting, in your own texts, proving it." He didn't have anything to say to that. There was nothing left to say. The criminal trial happened 5 months later. Denise and the district attorney's office had built something airtight: the engineer's testimony, Renata's financial trail, the messages between Derek and Priya discussing my life insurance, and the strategic value of an accident happening while I was deployed. Priya took a plea deal and testified against him in exchange for a reduced sentence on the fraud conspiracy charge. Derek's attorney tried to argue the railing damage was old wear mistaken for tampering, but Hollis's testimony was precise and unshakable, and the jury didn't take long. Felony child endangerment. Attempted insurance fraud. Conspiracy. He was sentenced to 11 years, with the possibility of parole after 7, and a permanent order, barring unsupervised contact with Eli, until a family court reviewed the case again when Eli turned 18, if Eli himself ever wanted that door reopened. I made it clear to the judge, and I'll make it clear to you now. That will be Eli's decision to make one day, not mine and not Derek's. I didn't cry in that courtroom. I saved that for later, the way I'd saved everything else. 6 months after the sentencing, the house looked different. I'd had the entire back porch torn out, not repaired, torn out completely, replaced with a small ground-level patio with no railing tall enough to climb, no structure a person could ever hide something inside again. I moved Eli's room to the first floor, close to mine, with a window that looks out over a yard, where I planted him a small garden bed because he'd gotten obsessed with a documentary about vegetables during his recovery. He calls it his farm. He's very serious about the tomatoes. It was a warm evening in late spring when Renata came by with a 6-pack and sat with me on the front steps of that renovated porch, the same steps where, months earlier, I used to sit and read Eli his bedtime stories through the hospital room window on video calls when I couldn't be there in person for every single night of his recovery. She handed me a beer, the can cold and sweating in the evening heat, and we sat there in silence for a minute, watching Eli chase fireflies across the new grass. "I'm an intelligence officer," I told her. "My entire job is reading threats before they materialize. I track patterns. I build cases out of fragments other people miss. And I missed the biggest one sitting across the dinner table from me every night for over a year." Renata didn't say anything comforting right away. She's not that kind of friend, which is exactly why I trust her. She took a sip of her beer and said, "Captain, you didn't miss it because you're bad at your job. You missed it because you were doing your job defending this country, and he used that against you. He knew you'd be gone. He knew you'd trust him to hold down the home front because that's what you needed to believe in order to keep doing what you do. That's not a blind spot in your training. That's a hole he dug on purpose, in the one place you weren't allowed to stand guard. I sat with that for a long time, watching my son laugh in the dark, cupping his hands around a firefly like it was the most precious cargo in the world. And for the first time since that text message in the hospital supply closet, I let myself cry. Not the controlled, efficient tears of someone managing a crisis, but the real, ugly, shaking kind, the kind you don't let yourself have when you're the one holding everyone else together. I'm talking to you now, the military spouse listening to this on a barracks laundry room floor because it's the only 10 minutes of quiet you get all day. The mother sitting in a hospital parking lot right now because something about your own house doesn't feel right and you've been too afraid to say it out loud. The sister, the daughter, the friend, whoever you are to the people who need you to hear this. You need 3 things to survive what I survived. First, you need discipline. Don't scream, don't shatter, don't let your grief turn into chaos that a lawyer can use against you later. Gather your intelligence quietly and let the system do the damage for you. Because the system, when you build the case correctly, hits harder and lasts longer than anything you could do with your own hands. Second, you need vigilance. Stop assuming love is the same thing as safety. Check the accounts. Read the messages you have every legal right to see. Look at the structures, literal and otherwise, that you've been trusting to hold weight, and ask yourself honestly whether anyone has actually reinforced them or just told you they did. Third, you need to stand back up. When you see the truth clearly, and it will come, don't collapse under it. Stand up, lock the door, and protect what's yours, because nobody is coming to do it for you faster than you can do it yourself. Derek is sitting in a federal facility right now because of his own greed and his own cowardice. I didn't put him there out of revenge. I put him there by refusing to look away from what the evidence was telling me. I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer in the comments below. Have you ever felt something was wrong in your own home and talked yourself out of trusting that feeling? Type "I know" in the comments if you understand exactly how hard it is to stop making excuses for someone you love. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe to this channel, and send it to someone in your life who needs to hear it tonight. Don't wait for the fall to check what's holding you up. Go look at the structures in your own life right now, the ones you've been trusting without question. Check the wiring, check the foundation, check the people standing closest to you.